Today we're going to do something a little bit different because we're going to cover 107 facts about Nickelodeon. Some facts you may already know, but probably also things you didn't know. Because this is about a studio rather than a single show or movie, we're also going to cover a bit more of the history of one of the largest distributors of children's entertainment in the world. That said, I'm Adrian, and let's get underway with 107 facts about Nickelodeon. Number 1. Nickelodeon was started by Dr. Vivian Horner on December 1st, 1977 as part of a test to see how popular a children's broadcast would be. As it turned out, it was popular, but not necessarily successful right out of the gate. Number 2. Part of this may have been that the initial test only ran in Columbus, Ohio. Why this specific city? Well, largely because of the Cube system, which was a closed-circuit TV network hooked up to about 30,000 homes. Number 3. Nickelodeon was able to piggyback on the start of the system by carving out a 2-hour time slot every day, 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., in which they exclusively broadcast the show Pinwheel. It was aimed at really young children, preschoolers. The creative director of the show was Vivian Horner. Yep, Nickelodeon's very first show was helmed by a woman. Number 4. Cube was part of Warner Cable. Yes, that Warner, the one that would later become Warner Brothers, which is only the most public part of the obscenely powerful and far-reaching Warner Media Group. Number 5. Commercially, this was not a big success, but not for the reason you might think. Back then, TV for children wasn't allowed to have commercials in it, but it was a great hook to sell the network idea to parents. After all, anything to shut the kids up for 2 hours, right? Number 6. And so, on April 1st, 1979, the project went nationwide in the US, with this newly commercially available technology called satellites to distribute it. Number 7. Of course, for it to go nationwide, they needed more than one show. So they had, among others, America Goes Bananas, a stand-up comedy show, and Nickel Flicks, which was canceled a mere 2 years later for ostensibly being too violent. Number 8. Incidentally, because of its short run, and because the magnetic tapes film was recorded on were in very high demand at the time, Nickel Flicks was all recorded over, and it's now considered a lost show where no copies of it remain. Number 9. One thing we still haven't talked about is the name, which some of you may be wondering about. Back in the very early days of film around 1900, Nickelodeons were small movie theaters, started in regular businesses where the staff would project silent films. Number 10. Still doesn't explain the name though. That is a contraction of a nickel, the price of admission, and an odeon, an ancient Greek word for a roofed-over theater. Good thing the price wasn't a dime. Number 11. So now you know the origins of this line.
I saw that in the Nickelodeon once and I always wanted to do it.
Number 12. And if you're wondering why you've never been to one of those, it's because they started being outcompeted by purpose-built cinemas around World War I, now that it became clear that movies were here to stay and it was worth the investment. Number 13. Back to the actual network, the year is 1981, and Nickelodeon is in trouble. Over the years, their time slot grew, now up to 13 hours every day, and they were still operating at a yearly loss of $10 million, not adjusted for inflation. Number 14. Warner Communications decided around that time that Nickelodeon wasn't worth it anymore, and sold off the company to MTV. Yes, that MTV. This was a bit of an in-house move though, as Warner also owned MTV. Number 15. Viewership was lacking too. Most shows failed to gain any kind of traction, and Nickelodeon was dead last when it came to viewership nationwide. Number 16. We're now in 1984. Nickelodeon has been running for 7 years, 5 of which fully public, and yet it has a grand total of 5 employees. Number 17. By now, their loss had increased to $40 million, which is nearly $100 million today when adjusted for inflation. In an attempt to reinvigorate the network, MTV made a golden move by handing creative control over to Fred Seibert and Alan Goodman, who by all conventional measures saved Nickelodeon by a widely effective rebranding. Number 19. Do put a pin in the name of Fred Seibert, because he'll become important later on. Number 20. On the business side of things, Geraldine Laybourne was put in charge, who wasn't uncontroversial for reasons we'll get to in a minute. But it worked, and she saved the network from almost certain bankruptcy. Number 21. But how did they pay for this? Well, it was Laybourne who made the decision that Nickelodeon would start airing commercials as well. Without going into politics too much, those regulations concerning advertising for children were relaxed under the Reagan administration, and this couldn't have come at a better time for Nickelodeon. Number 22. 1984 also saw the first use of the now famous Splash logo, which the network would use until 2009. Number 23. This rebranding worked, and by 1985, Nickelodeon was now the highest-rated children's channel in the United States. Number 24. It was also in 1985 that the network went from airing only part-time to airing full-time, starting in June, and it was also here that Nickelodeon really started leaning in on their credentials as the first network for children. Number 25, but apparently that wasn't good enough for Warner Communications, and so they sold off the entire stock to Viacom, which still owns Nickelodeon to this day. Number 26. Of course, you can't make a successful TV network without good shows, and some of the main ones they were leaning on were existing shows like Mr. Wizard's World, You Can't Do That on Television, and Livewire. Pinwheel was also still airing, although by now it was only reruns. Number 27. Filling the evening hours would of course be difficult for a children's network, so they were geared more towards adults, largely with reruns of The Donna Reed Show, a sitcom from the 1950s that would look instantly familiar to anyone who's seen WandaVision. Number 28. But it wasn't until 1988 and 1989 that the channel would become way closer to the Nickelodeon we would recognize today. They started the Kids' Choice Awards. Pinwheel was phased out in favor of Nick Jr. as the programming for preschoolers, and most relevantly to us, 1989 saw the green light for Nicktoons. Number 29. It's worth noting that before this point, Nickelodeon had never actually produced any kind of animated show, and all they aired was acquired cartoons. Number 30. That's not entirely accurate because in 1980 they produced Video Dream Theater, which was a failure in early test screenings and never actually made it to air. Number 31. But these acquired and often imported cartoons were successful, especially the Looney Tunes, and made enough money for Nickelodeon to fund the first 3 in-house animated shows: Doug, Rugrats, and The Ren and Stimpy Show. Number 32. These shows were very unusual for the time though. Most cartoons back then relied on some kind of existing IP, like Transformers or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but Nickelodeon actively steered away from that kind of branding. Number 33. Of these 3, Rugrats was the most successful one, with 172 episodes produced over 9 seasons and only ending production in 2004. Number 34. Both Doug and Ren and Stimpy had 52 episodes made while running at Nickelodeon. Though on Doug, it's worth mentioning that Disney bought the rights to the show in 1996 and made 3 more seasons totaling 65 episodes and even a movie. Number 35. Because of these successes, Laybourne's tenure as vice president and later president of Nickelodeon would become known as the network's golden age, lasting from 1984 to 1996. Number 36. Part of her tenure was the opening of Nickelodeon Studios in Orlando, Florida in 1990, as not only a place to film shows but also as an attraction for visitors and tourists. Number 37. This was an obvious attempt to mimic Disney's wildly successful theme parks, which at the time were very much carrying that company. However, Nickelodeon's version was much less successful, given that a lot of their shows were actually filmed in California and the attraction shut down in 2005. Number 38. Nickelodeon started selling their first cartoons on home media, VHS only at the time, in May 1993 to great success. This was in collaboration with Sony Wonder, blowing the starting whistle for a beautiful partnership that would certainly last forever and ever. Number 39. Until 1 year later, when parent company Viacom bought Paramount Pictures and forced Nickelodeon to re-release everything with their home entertainment branch instead. Number 40. And it's here that Nickelodeon really gained the confidence to spread its wings and venture out into other countries. In 1993, they started with the United Kingdom, Australia, and Germany. And this is a good illustration of how fast things were moving back then. By 1995, they were broadcasting in 70 countries. Number 41. Also around that time, we see the end of You Can't Do That on Television and the start of All That, which would go on to launch many careers, including those of Amanda Bynes, Gabriel Iglesias, and later on Jack DeSena. Number 42. Also around that time, 1996 to be exact, Laybourne left Nickelodeon and became president of Disney ABC cable networks, though this wasn't a huge success as she only worked there for 2 years. Number 43. Nickelodeon's new president became Herb Scannell, and he wanted to stake his bets differently. Number 44. Over the coming years, more and more shows would be released to varying degrees of success, like Rocko's Modern Life, Hey Arnold, The Wild Thornberrys, and Cat Dog. Number 45. Most of these shows did okay though, and ran for at least 4 or 5 seasons. Number 46. In July of that same year, Nickelodeon released its first movie to theaters, an adaptation of the book Harriet the Spy, starring Michelle Trachtenberg. One more career launched right there. Well done, Nick. Number 47. While the critical reception was middling, financially the movie did about as well as could be expected, earning back its $13 million budget twice over. Number 48. It would take another 2 years to release their first animated feature, the Rugrats movie. This was much more successful, becoming the first non-Disney animated movie to gross over $100 million in the US. Number 49. In 1998, with all that going, Nickelodeon quietly launched a series of shorts called Oh Yeah Cartoons, which had a modest 3-year run and mostly consisted of animated shorts, some of which would later go on to become full shows, but this one was never a huge hit. Number 50. 3 of the shorts that became their own show were Fairly OddParents, My Life as a Teenage Robot, and Chalk Zone. Number 51. So, let's bring back the name I told you a while ago, Fred Seibert. Why did I mention it? Well, because these cartoons were produced by Fred Seibert. Told you he would show up again. And his animation studio, Frederator Studios. Yep, this is where we got our start, in a partnership with Nickelodeon. Number 52. While most of their animated shows were successful, none of them were really capable of carrying the studio on their own, something that didn't really change until May 1st, 1999 with number 53.
Are you ready, kids?
Yes. This year saw the start of SpongeBob SquarePants, by far Nickelodeon's biggest hit, as it's still running to this day in its 13th season. Number 54. Believe it or not, but creator Steven Hillenburg had to fight Nickelodeon on a lot of creative decisions and almost walked out on the project altogether in 1997. One of the chief problems was SpongeBob's age. Hillenburg wanted him to be an adult while Nickelodeon wanted him to be a child in school. Number 55. In total, the entire SpongeBob franchise and its merchandise went on to earn Nickelodeon $13 billion so far. Number 56. But of course, it wasn't Nickelodeon's only show. The live-action shows continued as well, with some of the more notable ones being The Amanda Show, its spin-off Drake and Josh, and later Ned's Declassified School Survival Guide. Number 57. In fact, The Amanda Show itself was a spin-off from all that. Number 58. As mentioned before, The Fairly OddParents was made into a show of its own after its pilot in Oh Yeah Cartoons, but it definitely took its time to get there. However, of the 3, it was by far the most successful one, running for 10 seasons and clocking in at 172 episodes. Number 59. Now in 2002, Nickelodeon tried out something new, 3D animation with Jimmy Neutron, Boy Genius, their first dabbling in the animated realm outside of hand-drawn. Number 60. And here we enter one of the more interesting time periods for Nickelodeon, where they put out a number of shows that were critically well received and yet somehow lacked the viewership necessary to sustain them. These included Invader Zim, My Life as a Teenage Robot, and Danny Phantom. Number 61. The one that fans were probably the most angry over was Danny Phantom, which still has a fairly large cult following and even recurring petitions for Nickelodeon to make more episodes. Number 62. That said, My Life as a Teenage Robot was one of the oddest patterns, because it took Nickelodeon nearly 6 years to air just 40 episodes, which was probably the cause of the low ratings that led to its cancellation. Number 63. This is also where Nickelodeon first looked into its past for inspiration and decided it was worth a go to revamp Rugrats, only with the cast aged up a decade and with dealing with the issues that come with that, called All Grown Up. Number 64. While the show had a middling reception, mostly because it was a follow-up to Rugrats, it still did pretty well during its initial run. It had 5 seasons, while the average for Nickelodeon is usually only 3 or 4. Number 65. On the business side of things, Viacom wasn't sitting still. One of the shadier things they did was separate the ratings of Nickelodeon and Nick at Night, which they were accused of doing solely to boost the ratings of the main channel. Number 66. There's probably a core of truth to this, given that when Nielsen changed the rules that a channel should take up at least 51% of its airtime to qualify for ratings, so Nick at Night was dropped from those ratings. Number 67. Also around this point, for reasons that weren't very well understood, even at the time, Viacom split up. One half would keep the name Viacom, the part that ran Nickelodeon, and the other half would become CBS. The official reason given was that this was necessary to respond to a changing industry landscape, whatever that means. Number 68. But now we've reached the year 2005, and this was the year that Nickelodeon Studios in Florida finally closed down. Interest in game shows and sitcoms was in decline, and with Nickelodeon having more of a foothold in California, it just didn't make sense to keep the studio open. Number 69. The building itself still exists though, and for a long time was occupied by the Blue Man Group as their permanent staging ground. However, their residency ended in February of 2021, and the building is currently vacant. Number 70. This didn't end Nickelodeon's dive into theme parks though. They don't have truly independent parks like Disney does, but cooperate with SeaWorld Australia, Movie Park Germany, and a couple of others. Number 71. Worth mentioning is that Nickelodeon Universe in the Mall of America in Minnesota held the record for the largest indoor theme park in the West from 2008 until 2019. Number 72. They lost this record to themselves, because a slightly larger Nickelodeon Universe opened in American Dream in the Meadowlands in New Jersey. Number 73. We also haven't talked about Nick Jr. much, so let's change that. The thing is, Nick Jr. went through a lot of rebranding, but with a lot fewer changes than Nickelodeon itself after each one. It formally started after Nickelodeon ended Pinwheel in 1988 and gradually rose to prominence throughout the first half of 1989. Number 74. Unlike Nickelodeon though, all of Nick Jr.'s ideas were bought in from other studios, at least at first. One of the earlier success stories was with The Muppets, where they bought in shows from the Jim Henson Company. However, there was stiff competition from PBS and TLC, so Nick Jr. decided to go to in-house production as well. Number 75. The earliest success they had with this was Blue's Clues in 1996. This worked and gradually put Nick Jr. back ahead of the competition, and in 2000 launched what would become the backbone of the studio for nearly 20 years, Dora the Explorer. Number 76. In 2009, something of a weird move was made. Nick Jr. became its own separate channel under the same name, but the airtime slotted in the Nickelodeon main channel was now rebranded as Nick's Playdate. This would only last about 5 years though, as in 2014, the Nick Jr. brand returned. Number 77. And that didn't matter anyway, as the separate Nick Jr. channel kept on existing as well. And if all of this sounds like a giant corporate mess to you, it is. In fact, this isn't even half of it. So back to the main channel and back to the year 2005. Number 78. For those of you who are good with years or just fans of the show, you've probably guessed the one we're at. The big one. Yes, it's Cat Scratch. I'm kidding, I'm of course talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's hard to overstate how influential this show was, spawning comics, garbage movies, sequels, and more. Number 79. In fact, we're getting ahead of ourselves just a little bit, but both Nickelodeon and Netflix are looking to make new content in the Avatar universe. Number 80. For the 3 of you disappointed that I mocked it, Cat Scratch ran for 1 season, 20 episodes, and the general consensus seems to be, quote-unquote, passable. Number 81. In fact, of the 3 shows that premiered on Nickelodeon in 2005, the remaining one being the X's, only Avatar made it past its first season. Number 82. The funny thing is, after the unqualified success of Avatar, critics and audiences loved it alike, and it pulled in great ratings. Nicktoons really seemed to struggle finding a new foothold. Yes, SpongeBob and Fairly OddParents were holding up the studio, but now there's basically a 5-year period of shows premiering that would only run for 1 season, maybe 2, and then get cancelled again. Number 83. These are the aforementioned Cat Scratch and the X's, El Tigre, Tak and the Power of Juju, Back at the Barnyard, The Mighty Bee, Fanboy and Chum Chum, and Planet Sheen. Number 85. In 2006, Nickelodeon would see its 3rd president after Herb Scannell stepped down. This time, it was Seema Sargami taking the reins. Number 85. The next big thing for Nickelodeon was a cooperation with DreamWorks, which led to Penguins of Madagascar and Kung Fu Panda: Legends of Awesomeness both running for 3 seasons. Number 86. There was also a show based on Monsters vs. Aliens, but that only ran for 1 season and wasn't quite as big a hit. Number 87. The current state of affairs there is that DreamWorks was bought by NBC Universal and they stopped licensing their characters to Nickelodeon. Number 88. Rewind a few years to 2006. The live-action shows would get something of a boost though. The biggest boost for this was the start of iCarly in 2007, followed by Big Time Rush in 2009 and Victorious in 2010. These shows have remained pretty consistently popular, with iCarly even getting a revival from Paramount+, though that hasn't started airing yet. Number 89. But in 2009, something interesting happened on the business side, because Nickelodeon finally did something they had basically been avoiding ever since they started making cartoons themselves. They bought the rights to 2 existing properties, namely Winx Club and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Number 90. Winx Club was the first to hit the air, continuing with the story already established under the previous studio, Rainbow. It ran from 2011 to 2016 on Nickelodeon, but when Rainbow suffered a massive financial loss in 2014 with their movies Gladiators of Rome, there were very persistent rumors that the show would be cancelled. Luckily, this turned out not to be the case, but it did lead to some cost-cutting measures. Number 91. In 2011, something strange happened. For the first half of the year, Nickelodeon was the market leader in terms of viewership, which it had been for 17 years. But then midway through the year, the ratings took a nosedive. And why? Nobody knows. Even Viacom described it as inexplicable. Number 92. It would take until November 2012 for viewership to start rebounding, though it is much lower than the previous fall. Number 93. 2012 was a good year for Nickelodeon itself, however, with 2 big hits in the form of The Legend of Korra, the spin-off of Avatar, and the aforementioned Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Both of these helped with those viewership numbers. Number 94. Now these shows were big hits, but there is another pattern of shows only getting 1 or 2 seasons and frequently middling reviews and reactions. Number 95. That is until 2016 when Nickelodeon launches The Loud House, another massive hit, clocking in at 6 seasons and counting at the time of writing. Number 96. This show would eventually get a spin-off of its own called the Casagrandes, which we just did a video on. Go check it out, 107 Facts About the Casagrandes. Voiced by me, Adrian. Number 97, but also around this time, something of an exodus starts at Nickelodeon. First off, Chris Savino, creator of The Loud House, was fired in October 2017 after allegations of misconduct arose. In February 2018, Butch Hartman left the studio, and a month later, Nickelodeon parted ways with the creator of iCarly and Zoe 101, Dan Schneider. For similar reasons as Savino, and another 3 months later, Seema Zergami stepped down to pursue a different career at a studio of her own. Number 98, and we also have to mention that in that same year, Steven Hillenburg passed away from ALS. Even though he hadn't really been involved with SpongeBob since the movie in 2004, it's tragic that he died at age 57 from a brutal disease, and the world is poorer for it. Number 99. Now, a new president was needed, and this would become Brian Robbins, who had been working at one of Viacom's other properties, Paramount Players. He had only been president for 16 months there. Number 100, and apparently the industry landscape had changed because now Viacom decided that they did want to be together with CBS again because they remerged in 2019. Business is weird. Number 101, Nickelodeon hadn't been sitting on its hands though because they purchased Paws Inc., mainly for the rights to the Garfield franchise, which they're now working on a new show of, which should come out next year. Number 102. The current running animated shows do follow an industry-wide trend of angling for nostalgia dollars, with 4 of the 7 being either spin-offs or revamps. Number 103. Though it should be noted on the Rugrats revamp, they have changed it with the times. The original portrayed the character of Betty DeVille as a strong feminist with a weak husband. The revival has made her lesbian. Number 104. To tell you the truth though, this style of animation seemed like a good reminder of what we mentioned in our last Airbender comparison. 2D drawings converted to 3D renders frequently look strange. Number 105. So what does the future hold for Nickelodeon? Well, there are the aforementioned Avatar shows and the Garfield show. Then there's the agreement Nickelodeon signed with Hasbro to start airing a Transformers cartoon for the first time. So there's that. Number 106. There is also an upcoming project around Star Trek, which should have just started on Paramount Plus, but will go on Nickelodeon later. And last but not least, number 107. Remember how Nickelodeon had 5 employees and was $40 million in the red? They've turned it around because Nickelodeon now has close to 12,000 employees and a yearly revenue of $9.3 billion. That is a lot. And that's it. Pretty much the entire history of Nickelodeon and its key shows and moments. We were forced to leave out many shows and barely even touched upon the movies, because we really don't have room for everything. Nickelodeon's archive is massive, and it's just too much for one video. Should we cover more Nickelodeon? And what's your favorite show? Should we do other networks and brands and all of that stuff? Be sure to let us know in the comments below. I'm Adrian, thank you for watching, and remember, Frederator loves you.